The last person I ever expected to see transfigured, to witness become a vessel for the divine, was Leo, the very man who had, hours before, desecrated the most sacred space of my parish, and stolen the consecrated chalice from my own sacristy. The memory, still fresh and stinging, felt like a splinter in my soul. It was just after dawn, a time when the world usually feels newborn and hushed, especially on the Feast of the Assumption. I remember the scent of dew on the rectory garden roses, the particular slant of golden light that usually pierced the east-facing windows, promising hope and grace. But this morning there was no holy silence, only a violated one, heavy and suffocating like a shroud. I recall stepping into the chill morning air, a shiver unrelated to the temperature running down my spine. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a coarse, unholy dissonance. The flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers, a harsh, unwelcome intrusion, pulsed against the ancient weathered stones of St. Michael's, their rhythmic, insistent glow painting the exquisite stained-glass windows in an unholy, frantic dance of color. Saints and angels, usually serene, now seemed to writhe in a frantic, otherworldly agony, their faces streaked with the garish, pulsing hues. The wail of the sirens, though now quieted, still hummed in the pre-dawn air, a phantom vibration in my bones, leaving behind an ugly metallic echo that grated against the natural quietude of the morning, like a discordant note held too long. Inside, the sacred space that had known centuries of prayer and solace now buzzed with a sterile, urgent symphony of intrusion. Their radios crackled with clipped, impersonal voices, their footsteps echoed too loudly on the polished marble, their presence a jarring violation of everything this hallowed place represented. They were everywhere, these men in dark uniforms, their faces grim, their movements efficient, yet so utterly out of place. My sacristy, a small, intimate room where I prepared myself for the holiest of rites, felt utterly defiled. It was no longer a sanctuary of quiet prayer, but a crime scene. I saw the fine, gray fingerprint dust clinging to the worn wood of the altar linen cupboard where sacred cloths were kept. It clung to the very air, a fine, gritty film that seemed to settle not just on the furniture, but on my heart. Each clatter, each muttered word, each sweep of a gloved hand felt like a deliberate tear in the delicate fabric of reverence I had spent a lifetime weaving. They spoke of a witness, a grainy security camera's unforgiving capture, and a suspect. When Detective Miller, a kind but weary man who attended our 9 a.m. Mass sporadically, murmured the name Leo, it was less a shock and more a devastating confirmation of a fear I hadn't dared to voice. Leo, not the Leo I knew from years past, the cornerstone of our community, but a broken man now, reduced to a hollowed-out shadow of his former self. He was a man consumed by grief, his once bright eyes extinguished, his spirit withered. Once, not so long ago, he had been the most devout parishioner I knew, his faith a beacon, his presence a comfort. To see his name, even implicitly, attached to such a heinous act against the Church, against God, felt like a personal betrayal, a spiritual wound deeper than any physical blow. The impossibility of it all choked me, a physical constriction in my throat, in my chest. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, heavier than the pre-dawn mist that clung to the graveyard outside. A thief, a sacrilege. And then, incongruously, impossibly, a miracle. How could these three utterly disparate elements exist in the same breath, in the same man? They were tangled together, a Gordian knot that defied all human reason, a puzzle I couldn't begin to comprehend. My mind, trained in theology and the orderly progression of divine grace, reeled. How could Leo, a soul so lost, so hollowed out by grief that it seemed to have scooped out his very essence, so filled with a bitter, searing rage at God, be chosen as the vessel for a divine visitation? My pastoral heart ached for him, remembering the vibrant, hopeful man, the devoted husband and father. To think of the darkness that must have consumed him, the spiritual abyss he must have plumbed to commit such an act. And yet, the light chose him. How could a moment of such profound desecration an act of spiritual violence against the very body of Christ, be met not with condemnation, but with such celestial glory. It contradicted every logical pathway of faith, every precept of justice, yet affirmed the boundless, unfathomable mercy of God. The questions spun in my mind like a prayer wheel gone wild, each revolution deepening the mystery. The answers, I knew, lay somewhere just beyond belief, just past the threshold of human understanding, waiting to be revealed, like a dawn I had yet to fully witness. And I, a simple priest, was left to grapple with the stunning, terrifying, beautiful reality of it all. And yet, the light chose him. How could a moment of such profound desecration, an act of spiritual violence against the very body of Christ, be met not with condemnation, but with such celestial glory? It contradicted every logical pathway of faith, every precept of justice, yet affirmed the boundless, unfathomable mercy of God. The questions spun in my mind like a prayer wheel gone wild, each revolution deepening the mystery. The answers, I knew, lay somewhere just beyond belief, just past the threshold of human understanding, waiting to be revealed, like a dawn I had yet to fully witness. And I, a simple priest, was left to grapple with the stunning, terrifying, beautiful reality of it all. To truly comprehend the miracle, to truly understand the grace that poured forth at St. Michael's, I had to journey back, far beyond that twilight moment, past the broken sacristy door and the desolate cemetery gates. I had to remember Leo as he was, not as the ghost of grief and rage, but as the man who was, for so long, a very bedrock of our parish. Leo and his wife, Elena, were the kind of parishioners every priest dreams of, not just regular attendees, but active, vibrant participants in the lifeblood of St. Michael's. They were the first to arrive for the Sunday 7 a.m. Mass, their quiet reverence a palpable presence in the still waking nave. I can still picture them, nestled in the third pew from the front on the left, Leo's broad shoulders creating a silent bulwark for Elena, whose gentle smile was a balm. They were the last to leave, often lingering to help tidy the hymnals, or to simply sit in the quiet aftermath, absorbing the last echoes of grace. Their faith wasn't a performative spectacle. It was a deeply ingrained rhythm of their lives, as essential as breath. Their lives, and indeed our church, were truly illuminated when their daughter Sophia arrived. Ah, Sophia, a name that means wisdom, and she carried it with such an innocent grace. She was a radiant beam of light, not just between them, but for our entire community. I remember her tiny hand, often clutching her father's index finger as they walked the aisle. Her eyes, wide and curious, would sweep the stained glass windows, lingering on the vibrant saints, before settling on the altar with a child's unfiltered awe. She didn't just attend Mass, she absorbed it, her small body humming with a pure, untainted spirituality. I remember the day I baptized Sophia as if it were yesterday. The crisp, clean scent of the baptismal water, warmed just enough to be gentle on her newborn skin. Leo and Elena stood before me, their faces alight with a joy that transcended earthly happiness. Leo's hands, usually strong and calloused from his work as a carpenter, trembled slightly as he held his daughter. When I poured the water over her head, pronouncing the ancient words that welcomed her into the family of God, her wide eyes, the color of deep forest moss, looked up at me with a trust so pure it could make a cynic weep. It was a covenant, a sacred promise, made not just by her parents, but by the whole church, that this precious soul would be nurtured in faith. Leo's voice, usually so steady, caught in his throat as he affirmed his vows, a tear tracking a path down his cheek, a clear testament to the profound love and hope he held for his daughter's spiritual journey. He had presented her to God with an open heart, offering his most cherished possession into divine care. Years later, I watched Sophia take her first communion. The church was adorned with lilies, their sweet perfume mingling with the faint scent of beeswax candles. Sophia, dressed in a simple white dress, her hair adorned with a delicate floral wreath, walked towards the altar with a quiet dignity far beyond her years. Her hands were clasped in prayer, not out of instruction, but from an innate understanding of the solemnity of the moment. She knelt before me, her small frame vibrant with anticipation, and as I placed the body of Christ on her tongue, then offered her the precious blood from that very chalice. The silver vessel passed down through 3 generations of priests at St. Michael's, the one that would later be stolen. Her eyes closed in an act of profound, silent communion. Leo stood nearby, a Eucharistic minister, his gaze fixed on his daughter, a silent prayer of thanksgiving radiating from him. He saw in her the living embodiment of his own faith, a continuation of his devotion, a miracle in miniature. He was a man steeped in the sacraments, his life woven into the very fabric of our parish. He volunteered for everything, repairing the leaky roof, mending broken pews, even patiently tending the small rose garden outside the rectory. His faith was not theoretical. It was practical, hands-on, built into the very structure of his days. In these quiet moments of reflection, in the hushed sanctuary of my memory, I trace the path of Leo's faith. It was a strong and vibrant road, paved with unwavering devotion, marked by prayer and service. It was a road that seemed unassailable, a highway leading directly to the heart of God. How could such a path, so clear, so brightly lit by the love of his family and the grace of God, lead directly to a cliff's edge? How could the man who, with such reverence, watched his daughter receive the Eucharist from the consecrated chalice, come to wield that same chalice as a weapon of defiance against the very God he once adored? This is the agonizing question that haunts me still, a cold whisper in the quiet of the night. Why, God? Why do you allow such roads to be built? Why do you permit the strong foundations of faith to crumble under the weight of an unbearable cross? It's easy to understand why the unfaithful might stray, why those on the fringes might falter. But Leo, he was a pillar, a steadfast oak in the spiritual landscape of St. Michael's. His faith was not a fragile bloom, but a deeply rooted tree, nurtured by years of Mass, prayer, and selfless service. Yet, even the mightiest oak can be struck by lightning, its trunk split, its branches scattered, leaving behind only a hollow shell. I wrestle with this mystery, this profound paradox of divine allowance. Was it a test, a refinement, or simply the brutal, indifferent consequence of a fallen world? A world where even the most innocent are not spared. My theological training offers frameworks, concepts of free will and suffering, but they feel like dry bones in the face of such raw, human agony. I knew the answers offered by doctrine, yet they felt woefully inadequate to soothe the ache in my own pastoral heart, or to explain the chasm that opened beneath Leo's feet. For a man whose faith had been so intertwined with the presence of his beloved daughter, it seemed that her absence would inevitably become an absence of God himself. I knew, with a priest's intuition, that Leo's vibrant road, once so clearly marked by divine light, was about to descend into a darkness that even I, in all my years of ministry, had rarely witnessed. And the silence from heaven, when it came, would be more deafening than any storm. And the silence from heaven, when it came, would be more deafening than any storm. It began, as such things often do, with a whisper of unease, a persistent cough, a pallor that seemed to steal the very light from Sophia's cherubic face, a weariness that settled upon her vibrant spirit like an unwelcome shroud. At first, Elena and Leo, ever the optimists, dismissed it as a childhood cold, a lingering virus from kindergarten. But the cough deepened, the fatigue became a constant companion, and soon the doctor's office became a place of hushed tones and furtive glances. My heart, already attuned to the subtle shifts in my parishioners' lives, tightened with a premonition I dared not voice. Then came the diagnosis, delivered with the brutal efficiency of a surgeon's blade: cancer, an aggressive, unforgiving form that had already taken root, like a malevolent seed, in Sophia's small, vulnerable body. The word hung in the sterile air of the hospital corridor, a death knell that echoed not just through Sophia's family, but through the very heart of St. Michael's. It was as if a sudden, unseasonal frost had descended upon our vibrant parish garden, wilting the most tender and beautiful bloom. I remember visiting Sophia in the early days of her treatment, before the full ravages of chemotherapy had begun their relentless work. She was still Sophia, her eyes wide and curious, though shadowed now by a nascent understanding of her predicament. She drew me pictures of angels with enormous, benevolent wings, and once a crude but heartfelt rendering of our church, with me standing, a tiny stick figure, at its door. She spoke of Jesus as a friend who would make her strong again. Her faith, untainted by the complexities and doubts of adulthood, was a pure, unwavering flame. It was a beacon that, paradoxically, made the encroaching darkness all the more terrifying. How could such innocence be confronted with such brutality? How could God permit his lambs to suffer so profoundly? These were the questions that began to gnaw at the edges of my own peace, even as I strove to be a steadfast rock for Leo and Elena. Our parish, true to its spirit of communal love, responded with an outpouring of fervent prayer. We stormed heaven, not with a whisper, but with a roar. Weekday masses, once sparsely attended, swelled with worried faces. The perpetual adoration chapel, usually a quiet sanctuary, hummed with constant devotion. Vigils were held, candles flickering in the hushed gloom, each flame a small prayer lifted heavenward. Novenas were recited, rosaries slipped through countless fingers, the beads worn smooth by earnest petitions. God, hear our prayer, we chanted. Heal Sophia, Lord, in your mercy. The air in St. Michael's became thick with supplication, a collective plea for divine intervention. We truly believed, with an innocent, childlike faith, that if enough of us asked, God must surely answer. Leo, of course, was at the very vanguard of this spiritual army. His faith, once a quiet, steady river, now became a torrent, fierce and unyielding. He was always there, kneeling, head bowed, shoulders trembling, at the altar rail, in the adoration chapel, beside Sophia's hospital bed. But his prayer was no longer one of humble supplication, nor even of hopeful expectation. It was a prayer of demand, raw and desperate, born of a father's primal need to protect his child. He didn't ask God for strength to endure, or for grace to accept his will. He demanded Sophia's healing. "She's just a child, Lord," I heard him whisper once, his voice cracking, as I walked past the chapel late one evening, drawn by the sound of his anguish. He was alone, bathed in the soft, red glow of the sanctuary lamp. "She has her whole life ahead of her. Take me, take anything, but not her, not Sophia. What kind of God takes an angel from this earth, from her parents who love her more than life itself?" His hands were clasped so tightly, his knuckles white, that they looked less like hands in prayer and more like fists clenched against an invisible adversary. He was bargaining not with a hope for mercy, but with a desperate, almost angry challenge. His theological foundations, once so solid, were cracking under the unbearable weight of his suffering. I tried to minister to him, to remind him of Job, of Christ in Gethsemane, of the mysteries of suffering that transcend human understanding. But my words, carefully chosen from years of theological study, felt hollow in the face of his visceral agony. He would look at me, his eyes burning with an almost frightening intensity, and say, "Father, you don't understand. This isn't about faith. This is about justice. She is innocent. She deserves to live." He had crossed a threshold, moving beyond the humble posture of a believer to the defiant stance of an accuser. He was not just praying, he was raging against the very gates of heaven, demanding an explanation, a reprieve, a miracle. As Sophia's condition worsened, so too did Leo's desperation. The cheerful drawings gave way to weary sighs, the boundless energy to listless quiet. Her hair, once a cascade of golden brown, thinned and fell out in disheartening clumps. Her small body, once so plump and energetic, became fragile, almost translucent. The hospital rooms, once bustling with the determined hope of doctors and nurses, grew quiet, the air heavy with unspoken truths. I would sit by her bedside, holding her tiny hand, tracing the delicate blue veins beneath her pale skin, and feel the helplessness wash over me. I would pray, not just for Sophia, but for Leo, for Elena, for the strength to face what I knew, in my heart, was coming. There was one evening, as the last sliver of sun bled across the hospital window, painting the sterile room in hues of orange and purple, that Sophia looked up at me. Her voice was barely a whisper, a wisp of sound against the quiet hum of medical machinery. "Father Michael," she said, her eyes surprisingly clear, "will Jesus really take me to heaven? Will it be like the pictures?" I swallowed hard, my throat thick with emotion. "Yes, sweet Sophia," I managed. "He will, and it will be even more beautiful than you can imagine. He loves you very, very much." She smiled then, a faint, ethereal smile that seemed to catch the last light of the day, and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I knew she was ready. She had made her peace, long before the adults around her could even begin to comprehend the depths of their sorrow. And then, the silence. It came on a Tuesday morning, soft and insidious. The machines, which had beeped and whirred and breathed for her for so long, finally surrendered their battle. The hurried footsteps of nurses, the urgent whispers, the frantic, measured movements around her bed, all gave way to a profound, crushing stillness. Elena, her face a mask of unspeakable grief, was holding one of Sophia's hands. Leo, rigid as stone, held the other. Her small chest, which had fought so valiantly for every breath, stilled. Her eyes, those beautiful, innocent wells of trust, closed for the last time. In her hand, clutched with the gentle tenacity of a child's grip, was the small, worn rosary I had given her for her first communion. It was still there, a symbol of faith held fast, even as life itself slipped away. For Elena, in her quiet, tear-filled surrender, the rosary was a comfort, a tangible link to the divine mercy she knew, somehow, was still present. It was a sign that Sophia was not truly gone, but merely transformed, taken into the loving embrace of God. Her grief was deep, profound, but laced with a quiet, unwavering trust. For Leo, however, the silence was definitive. It was not peace. It was an answer. And that answer, he believed with every fiber of his being, was a cruel, resounding no. God had not heard his pleas. God had not acknowledged his demands. God had not honored his bargaining. In that moment, watching the life drain from his daughter's eyes, the rosary a stark, almost mocking contrast in her lifeless hand. Leo did not just lose Sophia. He lost his God, the God he had loved, worshipped, and served. The God to whom he had dedicated his life and his family had, in his eyes, abandoned him. The light that had once illuminated his path, that had guided him to Mass every Sunday, that had filled his heart with joy during Sophia's baptism and First Communion, had been snuffed out. There was no explanation, no solace, only a vast, empty chasm where his faith once stood. Elena's quiet, grief-stricken faith, which found solace in prayer and community, became a wall between them. She sought comfort in the Mass, in the company of parishioners who offered condolences and shared memories of Sophia's bright spirit. Leo, however, recoiled from it all. The very sight of the church, the sound of hymns, the gentle comfort of familiar faces, felt like a betrayal. They were reminders of the God who, he felt, had forsaken him, and of a community that, through no fault of its own, had failed to pray hard enough. He vanished from the church, not with a dramatic exit, but with a slow, agonizing withdrawal. He stopped coming to Mass. He stopped volunteering. He stopped returning phone calls. He became a ghost, haunting the edges of our community, a shadow of the man he once was. His once vibrant faith, once the bedrock of our parish, had been shattered, pulverized by the relentless wave of grief and the perceived silence of a heaven that had refused to intervene. And in that silence, I saw a darkness beginning to grow in Leo, a bitterness that threatened to consume him entirely, leaving only embers where a burning love for God once resided. It was a silence that would reverberate, echoing in the cavern of his soul, waiting for a different kind of sound, a different kind of answer. the silence that had settled upon Leo's soul, the terrible absence of God he perceived, had long felt like a gathering storm within him, a void contained, albeit barely, by the sheer force of his grief. But the morning I discovered the theft, that internal silence roared out, a destructive force that shattered the fragile peace of St. Michael's and echoed the very bitterness I had seen festering like a spiritual gangrene in his eyes. It was still early, the kind of hushed, liminal hour when the world feels suspended between slumber and awakening. The first tentative, pearlescent rays of dawn had just begun to filter through the magnificent stained-glass windows of St. Michael's, painting the nave in ethereal washes of sapphire blues and burnished golds. These were the moments I cherished, when the church, stripped of its congregants and the bustle of the day, felt most profoundly itself, a vessel awaiting the divine. The air, typically still crisp with the lingering chill of night, carried the faint, sweet, comforting scent of old incense and beeswax, a fragrance interwoven with decades of whispered prayers and fervent hopes. Outside, I could hear the distant, almost muffled chirping of the early birds, a gentle symphony that only underscored the deep quiet within these sacred walls. I had just finished my private prayers in the rectory chapel, a ritual that anchored my day, offering me a moment of solitary communion before the responsibilities of the parish began to clamor. I remember that morning's prayer with particular clarity. I had been holding Leo and Elena in my heart, their names a silent plea on my lips, asking God for some sign of peace for their tormented souls. A quiet unease had stirred within me even then, a vague premonition I couldn't articulate, a faint shadow across the sunlit path of my devotion. Dismissing it as the weariness of an aging shepherd, I was making my way to the sacristy, my thoughts already turning to the readings for the morning's first Mass, a daily preparation that always brought a quiet joy. My footsteps, usually a gentle rhythmic scuff against the ancient stone floors, a familiar echo in the hallowed space, seemed to halt, suspended in the sudden, jarring stillness that descended upon me as I approached the sacristy door. It was a silence deeper than the dawn's quiet, a heavy, unnatural hush that pressed in on my ears, a distinct absence of the usual creaks and hums of an old building coming to life. Every instinct, honed by decades of living within these sacred walls, screamed that something was profoundly, irrevocably wrong. A cold knot of apprehension began to tighten in my stomach, a precognitive dread that bypassed logic and went straight to the soul. The door. It was not the familiar, heavy oak door I had known for 30 years, a stout and venerable sentinel guarding the sacred space beyond. This door, usually flush within its sturdy frame, now hung askew, a gaping maw in the wall. Its ancient hinges, which typically groaned with a sound of long-suffering endurance, now shrieked silently under an unnatural strain. A jagged splinter of dark, aged wood protruded from its frame like a broken bone, a fresh wound in the otherwise unyielding timber. It was as if the very fabric of the church had been violently rent. My heart seized in my chest, a cold, hard knot of dread solidifying there. This was no accidental damage, no mere wear and tear of time or a clumsy parishioner. This was force, raw and brutal, a clear act of violation. A shiver, colder than the morning air that now seemed to seep through the gap in the door, traced its way down my spine, raising goose flesh on my arms. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, the tortured wood groaning louder in protest, scraping against the stone floor. Each creak was a fresh wound to my ears, a lament for the sanctity that had been breached. I stepped over the threshold, not with the familiar reverence I usually afforded this sacred boundary, but with a trepidation that felt like sacrilege itself, as if my very presence acknowledged and completed the violation. The dim, filtered light from the nave barely penetrated the sacristy, leaving the room shrouded in a murky gloom that only amplified the sense of disquiet. The sacristy, usually a meticulously ordered space, a sanctuary within the sanctuary where the sacred vessels and vestments were carefully kept, was in utter disarray. My eyes, accustomed to the precise placement of every chalice cloth, every censer, every stole, struggled to comprehend the chaos before me. Drawers, usually kept locked and tidy, had been pulled open with frantic violence, their contents, linen altar cloths, purificators, small cruets for water and wine, spilled onto the stone floor, some crumpled like discarded thoughts, others tangled into grotesque knots. Books of prayer and liturgical instructions lay flung open, their pages torn or creased. A sense of frantic desperation hung in the air, a palpable echo of the haste and disregard of the intruder. It wasn't just untidy, it was desecrated, a physical manifestation of a spiritual violence that made my stomach churn. But my eyes, guided by an instinct honed by years of priesthood, immediately sought out the most sacred space within this room, the small ornate cabinet where the chalice and paten were kept, directly adjacent to the tabernacle. It was the heart of the sacristy, the place of highest reverence, and it was there that the full horror of the situation unfurled before me. It was worse than I could have imagined. The tabernacle veil, the delicate, intricately embroidered cloth that draped the sacred box where the consecrated hosts resided, had been torn aside. It wasn't simply displaced, it had been ripped from its hooks with a savage, deliberate disregard. Its fine threads hanging in tatters, a silent, eloquent scream in the dim morning light. The sheer audacity, the raw contempt for the sacred implied by such an act, sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, choked sound. My first, most primal fear, a terror that eclipsed all others, was for the Blessed Sacrament itself. Had they? No. Please God, no. The thought was too unbearable to fully form, a blasphemy in its very contemplation. Had the body of Christ been violated? Had the ultimate sacrilege been committed? Every fiber of my being recoiled from the possibility. I rushed forward, my steps unsteady on the scattered cloths and overturned items, my hands trembling violently as I reached for the small golden tabernacle door. It was cold to the touch, heavy with the weight of its sacred trust. I pulled it open with a prayer tearing from my silent lips. Inside, nestled within the golden ciborium, were the consecrated hosts, pure and white, untouched. They lay there, luminous, even in the gloom, small circles of divinity, serene and inviolate. A wave of profound, shuddering relief washed over me, so potent it left me weak at the knees, my legs threatening to give way. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting out a long, ragged breath I hadn't realized I was holding. They had not been desecrated, not in the most terrible way. The body of Christ was safe. For this, I gave a silent, fervent thanksgiving, a heartfelt Deo gratias that trembled in the quiet air. But then, as my eyes adjusted and my gaze steadied, it fell upon the empty space beside the ciborium, within the very cabinet that housed the most sacred of our vessels, the space where the chalice should have rested. My heart sank, a leaden weight in the pit of my stomach, a cold dread replacing the warmth of relief. The silver chalice, exquisite in its simplicity, its surface gleaming with the patina of time and countless blessings, was gone. It wasn't merely an object of monetary value, though its craftsmanship and age made it so. Its worth extended far beyond silver and gold. It was, or chalice, a vessel that had held the blood of Christ at countless masses, at first communions, at the anointing of the dying, through generations of joy and sorrow within St. Michael's walls. It was the very chalice from which Sophia, Leo's own daughter, had received her first Holy Communion, her small, innocent hands clasped beneath it, her face alight with a wonder that truly understood the mystery she was receiving. I remembered the delicate weight of the chalice in my own hands that day, her bright, trusting eyes fixed on the host, a pure reflection of faith. To me, it was not just metal, it was a tangible link to the unbroken chain of faith, a sacred conduit between heaven and earth, imbued with the prayers and sacrifices of all who had gazed upon it. Its absence was a gaping wound, not just in the sacristy, but in the spiritual heart of our parish. This was more than a theft of a precious object. It was a desecration, an act of profound spiritual violence. It spoke not of common greed, of a thief seeking easy money, but of a deeper, more vengeful intent, a desperate message hurled at the divine. Who would do such a thing? Who would violate the sanctity of this place, not for the obvious gains, but with a disregard so blatant, so personal? It felt like a slap in the face of God himself. The brutal force, the torn veil, the specific targeting of the chalice. It wasn't random. It felt like an act of rebellion, a calculated insult. My mind, even in that initial shock and the haze of dismay, began to trace the outlines of a familiar shadow, a dread premonition that had whispered to me even before I entered the sacristy. The bitterness I had witnessed in Leo, the raw, unyielding rage simmering beneath his grief, the way he had turned his back on God and his house, it all coalesced into a terrifying, gut-wrenching possibility. No, it couldn't be. Not Leo. Not the man who had loved this church with such devotion, whose life had been so intertwined with its rituals, its sacraments. Not the man I had seen kneel at this very altar, tears streaming down his face, begging for his daughter's life. But the splintered door, the torn veil, the missing chalice, it felt like the raw, unadulterated pain of a soul at war with God, a cry of defiance from someone pushed to the very brink of despair. Who else could hate God enough to steal from him in such a personal, symbolic way? With a heavy heart, I called the police, my voice feeling strangely detached as I relayed the facts, the words sounding alien and hollow in the sacred stillness of the ruined sacristy. The mundane act of making a police report in a space usually reserved for the preparation of the Eucharist felt like a further intrusion, a painful blending of the sacred and the profane. Detective Miller arrived with a patrol officer, their presence a stark, almost sterile intrusion into the sacred space. The crackle of their radios, the efficient click of a camera shutter, the focused beams of their flashlights cutting through the dim morning light, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, all were a jarring contrast to the quiet reverence and spiritual weight that usually permeated St. Michael's. Detective Miller was a man of quiet competence, his eyes missing nothing of the physical scene, yet his understanding of the spiritual dimensions of this violation was, understandably, limited to the tangible. He surveyed the disarray, his brow furrowed, taking notes with a methodical precision, asking questions in a calm, professional tone that barely registered the spiritual anguish I felt. "Any idea who might do something like this, Father?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the chaos, pausing on the torn veil and the empty chalice cabinet. "Someone with a grudge, maybe? Or a desperate addict looking for easy cash?" I shook my head slowly, my throat tight. A lump of unspoken grief lodged there. "No, Detective, not that I can imagine. Everyone here, this is their home, their sanctuary. This is where they come for comfort, for solace." Even as I spoke the words, I felt the lie of omission hanging heavy in the air, a silent betrayal of my deepest fear. I had an idea, a terrible unspoken suspicion that I wasn't ready to voice. Not yet. To accuse Leo, even to myself, felt like a betrayal of the past, of the man I had known, the devout parishioner, the loving father. It felt like adding another brick to the wall between him and God, a wall I desperately hoped to tear down. They dusted for prints, took photographs, and eventually the detective came back to me, a small, grainy image held carefully in a clear plastic bag. "We found something on one of the exterior security cameras from a nearby business, Father. Might be our man." He handed me the image. It was blurry, a low-resolution capture taken from a distance, showing a figure slipping out the side door of the church just before dawn. The individual was hunched, wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt, their face obscured by shadow and the poor quality of the camera's lens. There was no clear feature, no identifying mark that would stand out to a stranger. My eyes, however, weren't drawn to the face, or its lack thereof. They were drawn to the posture, the way the shoulders slumped forward, a defeat that seemed to emanate from the very bones, a weariness so profound it was almost visible. And then the gate. a familiar, shuffling walk, as if carrying an impossibly heavy burden, not just in their hands, but in their very soul. It was a walk I had seen countless times, a walk that had become more pronounced, more burdened, more agonizingly slow in the years since Sophia's passing. I had watched him walk across the church parking lot, his steps dragging, his back bent, carrying an invisible weight that seemed to crush him. My breath hitched. The world seemed to narrow to that single, pixelated image, the dim, violated sacristy fading into the background. It was unmistakable. Even through the poor quality, even with the hood obscuring his features, even in the semi-darkness of the photograph, I recognized him with a chilling certainty that went deeper than visual identification. It was Leo, my Leo, the man who had once knelt in the front pew, his eyes alight with faith, now reduced to a silhouette of sorrow and rage, stealing from the very house he once served with such devotion, from the God he felt had forsaken him. The recognition was a physical blow, sharper and more painful than any splintered wood or torn fabric. It wasn't just the theft. It was the confirmation of how far he had fallen, how deeply the bitterness had taken root, choking out the last vestiges of hope and faith. I felt a profound ache, a grief that mingled with my shock, not just for the stolen chalice, not just for the violation of St. Michael's, but for Leo's lost soul, for the broken man I now saw before me in that grainy photograph. The silence from heaven he had perceived had indeed been met with a different kind of answer, a destructive act born of despair, an echo of his own cry for vengeance against a God he believed had wronged him. My heart cried out, not in judgment, but in an overwhelming sorrow that welled up from the deepest part of my pastoral soul. How could a man so broken find no solace, no hope, but instead turn his pain into such a desperate act of defiance? The stolen chalice wasn't just an object, it was a symbol of his shattered faith, a desperate, misguided attempt to strike back at the God he felt had abandoned him. It was a cry for attention, a scream of anguish in the void. And in that moment, standing amidst the disarray of the sacristy, holding the grainy image of a man I once called my most devout parishioner, I knew with a chilling certainty that finding Leo was no longer just about recovering a stolen item. It was about confronting a soul in freefall, about trying to pull a beloved son back from the very precipice of despair. This was no longer just a police matter. It was a crisis of faith, a spiritual emergency that cried out for intervention, a desperate plea that only God's mercy, through his broken earthly shepherd, could possibly answer. I knew with absolute clarity that I had to find him, and I had to do it before anyone else did. The urgency that had settled in my bones in the sacristy solidified into a cold, hard resolve. The police would approach this as a crime, a violation of property, perhaps even a felony. But what I saw in that blurry image, what I heard in the echo of Leo's desolation, was a scream from a soul in freefall. This wasn't about silver and gold. It was about salvation. It was a crisis of faith, a desperate plea that only God's mercy, channeled, however imperfectly, through his broken, earthly shepherd, could possibly answer. I knew, with absolute clarity, that I had to find him, and I had to do it before anyone else did. My mind raced, not with a detective's logic, but with a pastor's intuition. Where would a man, broken by grief, rage, and now the profound act of sacrilege, go? Not home, certainly. Elena, in her quiet, enduring sorrow, would be a mirror to his own torment, a living reminder of all he had lost, of the God he had abandoned. Not to sell the chalice, for the image in my mind wasn't of a thief seeking profit, but of a man waging a war with God. And when one wages such a war, one often returns to the battlefield where the greatest defeat was suffered, the cemetery. My old sedan, usually a steady, unhurried companion on pastoral visits, seemed to hum with my own agitated pulse. The late afternoon sun, usually a gentle balm, felt like a spotlight on my desperate quest. Each turn, each familiar street I traversed, pulled me deeper into the labyrinth of Leo's pain, a path I knew all too well from our shared journey through Sophia's illness. I prayed, not with the rote repetition of a rosary, but with a raw, guttural longing for guidance. Lord, show me where he is. Show me how to reach him. Do not let him be lost. The gates of St. Anne's Cemetery loomed ahead, an iron lacework against the fading light, always a place of quiet sorrow and eternal rest. Today, however, it felt like the very maw of despair. I parked hastily, the crunch of gravel under my tires loud in the twilight stillness, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran down my spine. The air here always carried a particular weight, a collective sigh of grief and memory. Today, it felt heavy, with an unspoken accusation. I walked the familiar paths, past rows of stoic headstones, each a silent testament to a life lived, a love lost. My eyes scanned for a figure, a sign, anything. And then, there he was. He stood by Sophia's small granite marker, a silhouette against the low, bruised purple of the western sky. His back was to me, his shoulders, once so broad and resolute, now slumped in a posture of utter defeat. But it wasn't just his stance that drew my breath. It was what he held, clutched in his hands, not gently, but almost violently, was the chalice. The same silver vessel, glinting dully in the dim light that had so often held the body and blood of Christ. The same chalice from which Sophia, her face radiant with childlike faith, had received her first Holy Communion. Now, in Leo's hands, it was no longer a sacred vessel. It was a weapon, or perhaps, more accurately, a conduit for his rage, a focal point for his despair. He wasn't praying, at least not in any way I recognized. He was talking to it. His voice, a low, guttural rasp, carried on the faint breeze a broken litany of anger and sorrow. I stopped a respectful, cautious distance away, hidden mostly by the ancient weeping willow, its branches like trailing fingers reaching for the earth. I needed to hear, to understand the depth of the chasm that had opened in his soul. "Here," he rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears and a palpable venom, as if he were addressing not an object, but a living, breathing entity. "Here it is. Your precious thing." He shook the chalice slightly, a subtle tremor that spoke volumes of his inner turmoil. "You want it back, don't you? You always want things back. You take, and then you want your symbols of, what? Your generosity?" A bitter laugh, devoid of humor, escaped him. "Generosity? Is that what you call it? Taking a child, a pure, innocent child? For what? To teach me a lesson? To test my faith?" His voice cracked, and he lowered his head, pressing his forehead against the cool silver of the chalice. For a moment, he was silent, and I thought perhaps the torrent was over. But then he lifted his head, his eyes, even from this distance, seeming to blaze with a tormented fire. "I prayed," he continued, his voice rising in intensity, a fierce accusation aimed at the heavens. "Oh, how I prayed! Remember, Father, we all did. Vigils, novenas, adoration. We stormed the gates of heaven, didn't we? And what did we get? Silence. Just silence. A cruel, mocking silence while she faded, while she suffered." He gestured wildly with the chalice towards Sophia's grave, as if indicting the very ground beneath their feet. "She loved you. She loved this ritual, this promise. She believed, Father. She believed with every fiber of her tiny being. And you let her go. You ripped her away. For what? Some grand cosmic plan I'm too stupid to comprehend?" His words, raw and unvarnished, were a dagger to my own heart. I understood, intimately, the pain that fueled them. I had watched him, held his hand, prayed beside him through every agonizing step of Sophia's illness. His faith had been a magnificent, towering edifice, built on rock. To see it now, shattered and splintered, its fragments weaponized against the very God it once honored, was almost unbearable. "This chalice," he murmured, his voice now dropping to a chilling whisper. "It's supposed to be where you live, isn't it? Your body, your blood, your presence. Well, I held it, I carried it, and it felt empty, just like my life, just like my prayers, just like your promises." He squeezed the chalice, his knuckles white. He took what was most precious to me, Father. He took my Sophia, and I'm just taking back what's most precious to him. It's only fair." His words, delivered to the silent, unfeeling Silver, echoed the sentiment I had heard in Detective Miller's office. "He took what was most precious to me, Father. It's only fair I do the same." The phrase, now articulated with such visceral pain, reverberated through my soul. He wasn't speaking of a material theft. He was speaking of a cosmic trade, a desperate, misguided attempt to balance an unbearable scale of justice he felt had been tilted against him. I took a deep breath, the chill air sharp in my lungs. My presence here felt like a trespass, an intrusion on a sacred, horrifying agony. Yet I couldn't remain hidden. This broken lamb needed a shepherd, even if he would bite the hand that offered solace. Stepping out from behind the willow, I walked slowly, deliberately, towards him. Each step was a prayer, a silent plea for wisdom, for strength, for the right words. How does one confront a man who has lost everything, a man whose faith has curdled into bitter resentment, a man who believes he is exacting a righteous vengeance on God himself? He heard my footsteps, or perhaps sensed my presence. He froze, the chalice still clutched in his hands, his back still to me. The silence that followed his last, defiant words was profound, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow and the rustle of dry leaves. He turned slowly, like a man weighed down by invisible chains. The last vestiges of twilight cast his face in deep shadow, but even so, I could see the devastating transformation. The vibrant, hopeful man I knew was gone, replaced by a specter of grief. His eyes, once so bright and full of life, were hollowed out, dark pools reflecting an abyss of sorrow and raw, unquenchable anger. There was no surprise in them, no fear of being caught, no attempt to flee, only a profound, weary recognition. He looked at me, his gaze unblinking, devoid of any warmth. He didn't speak, but the question was palpable in the air between us. "Why are you here?" And then, his voice, still raspy but now quieter, imbued with a terrible finality, broke the silence. He held up the chalice, not offering it, but presenting it as an exhibit in his cosmic case against God. "He took what was most precious to me, Father," Leo said, his words slow and deliberate, each syllable a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. "It's only fair I do the same." My heart ached, a physical pain in my chest. There was no trace of the old Leo in that statement, no flicker of the devout man who had once knelt humbly before the altar. Only a raw, unyielding demand for cosmic fairness, forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss. I looked at the chalice in his hands, then at his ravaged face, and knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the task before me was far greater than retrieving a sacred object. It was about retrieving a soul teetering on the very edge of damnation, not from malice, but from the unbearable burden of a broken heart. How do you shepherd a man who believes God himself is his enemy? How do you offer solace when he feels utterly abandoned? The answer, I knew, lay not in argument, nor in reprimand, but in the unwavering, persistent presence of mercy, no matter how fiercely he might reject it. And so I stood there, bathed in the fading light, bracing myself for the profound spiritual battle that lay ahead. The air grew heavy with the weight of that unspoken battle. I stood before Leo, a shepherd confronting a lost sheep who believed the very hand that would guide him was instead aiming to strike. He didn't run, as I had half expected. He didn't charge at me either, though I sensed a volcanic fury simmering beneath his ruined exterior. Instead, he simply looked through me, as if I were a translucent ghost, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he began to walk. Not away, not toward me, but in a direction that surprised us both, back towards the town, back towards St. Michael's. His steps were heavy, each one an act of profound resistance against an invisible current. He moved like a man walking to his own execution, not with a quick, despairing rush, but with the dragging, unwilling gait of one whose spirit is already broken, yet whose body still protests. The stolen chalice, which had been a weapon in his tirade against the heavens, was now clutched against his chest, almost protectively, as if it were the only thing grounding him to this painful reality. It wasn't a gesture of reverence. It was the desperate grasp of a drowning man, clinging to the very thing he sought to cast away. I followed, maintaining a respectful distance, my heart a complex knot of fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. The sun, which had been a fiery orb earlier, now dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and melancholic orange. The cemetery gates receded behind us, the quiet dignity of the headstones giving way to the murmur of late afternoon traffic on the distant main road. Each step we took was a step further from the sacred ground where Sophia lay, and a step closer to the sanctuary he had so violently rejected. What was driving him, I wondered? Was it a flicker of old faith, an unconscious pull towards a place that had once been his anchor? Or was it something far darker, a desire to complete his act of defiance on hallowed ground, to make his rage a public spectacle before the very altar he had served? I offered silent prayers with every footfall, a litany of desperate pleas for guidance, for understanding, for mercy. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Soften his heart. Show him your face, Lord, even in this darkness. The journey back was a strange, silent procession. The few people we passed on the quiet residential streets either averted their gaze, sensing the palpable distress emanating from Leo, or looked at us with a curious, questioning glance, perhaps noting the chalice, perhaps my clerical collar, and surmising some grave, unspoken drama. I kept my eyes on Leo's back, on the way his shoulders slumped, carrying not just the chalice, but a burden of grief so immense it threatened to buckle him. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a testament to the raw wound in his soul. I thought of Job, that ancient patriarch who lost all, yet struggled to maintain his integrity even in his accusations against God. But Leo's struggle felt different, more visceral, less philosophical. It was the howl of a creature in pain, stripped bare of all artifice, all civility, all the social niceties that usually cushion our grief. He was a raw nerve exposed to the chill evening air, and I, his priest, felt as helpless as any witness to a natural disaster. As we neared the main square, the imposing silhouette of St. Michael's began to dominate the skyline. Its twin spires, usually symbols of steadfast hope reaching towards heaven, seemed to me then like silent, unyielding judges, bearing witness to Leo's despair. The evening light caught the stained glass windows, making them glow from within with a kaleidoscope of sacred stories, stories of sacrifice and redemption that, for Leo, must have felt like a cruel mockery. He slowed as we approached the church grounds, his pace becoming even more deliberate, as if each step now required an act of Herculean will. He didn't head for the side door he had splintered in his haste, nor for the more discreet sacristy entrance. No, Leo walked directly to the massive oak doors of the main entrance, the very doors through which he had carried Sophia for her baptism, through which he had led Elena to their wedding pew, through which he had entered countless times as a faithful servant. He stopped there, on the threshold. The setting sun, now a vast, smoldering ember on the horizon, cast the entire facade of St. Michael's in a fiery orange glow, making the ancient stones seem to burn with an inner light. Leo stood directly on the line where the final step met the church's foundation, a place neither fully in the world nor fully in the sanctuary. It was a liminal space, a boundary, a place of transition, or perhaps, in this case, a place of ultimate confrontation. His body was rigid, trembling slightly. The chalice was still clutched in his hands, now raised a little higher, no longer a protective shield, but an offering, albeit one steeped in defiance. He stared up at the vast, impassive heavens, his face contorted with an emotion so fierce it looked like a mixture of fury and despair. "Here!" he screamed, his voice raw and ragged, tearing through the quiet evening air. It was not a question, nor a plea, but a demand, an ultimatum. The sound echoed off the church walls, then dissolved into the soft rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks that flanked the entrance. My own breath hitched in my throat. I stood a few yards behind him, rooted to the spot, watching this agonizing spectacle unfold. My mind raced, trying to understand, to anticipate. Was this the moment he would hurl the chalice, shattering it against the sacred doors? Was this the final irreversible act of a man whose faith had been utterly demolished? He lifted the chalice higher still, holding it aloft like a trophy of his suffering, or perhaps a chalice of wrath. His shoulders shook, and I could see the muscles in his neck strain as he threw his head back. "Take it back!" he roared, his voice cracking with the unbearable weight of his sorrow. "It's no substitute for her." The words hung in the air, heavy and profound. No substitute for her. It was the rawest prayer I had ever heard, stripped bare of all piety, all reverence, all expectation of divine kindness. It was a direct accusation, a desperate lament that echoed the very words of Christ on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But where Christ's cry was born of total obedience and divine will, Leo's was born of utter dereliction, a challenge flung into the face of a God he felt had abandoned him. In that moment, standing on the hallowed ground before St. Michael's, bathed in the dying light of day, I witnessed the full measure of human suffering. Leo wasn't just grieving for Sophia. He was grieving for his lost faith, for the God who had once been his comfort, and now felt like his tormentor. He wasn't a thief in the traditional sense. He was a broken man, acting out a spiritual violence in response to the violence he felt had been done to his own soul. My heart ached with a mixture of profound sadness and an almost unbearable sense of helplessness. I wanted to rush to him, to embrace him, to whisper words of comfort, to remind him of God's enduring love. But I knew, instinctively, that any such gesture would be futile, perhaps even counterproductive. He was beyond the reach of human comfort, locked in a solitary battle with the divine. He had to utter his full complaint, to lay bare the depths of his pain and anger, for any healing to begin. This was not a moment for pastoral intervention, it was a moment for witness. And so, I stood there, a silent sentinel, my hands clasped, my own lips moving in a quiet prayer of petition, not for him to be silent, but for God to listen, for God to respond, for God, in his infinite mercy, to look upon this bruised and broken soul standing defiant on his very doorstep, and to show him a face other than the one he believed had turned away. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening, a vacuum where the universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? I dared not even imagine. All I knew was that something had to break, something had to give, in this standoff between a heartbroken father and the seemingly silent heavens. The threshold of St. Michael's had become an altar of raw, unvarnished human grief, and the chalice, a bitter offering. The threshold of St. Michael's had indeed become an altar of raw, unvarnished human grief, and the chalice, a bitter offering. Leo stood there, a silhouette against the last defiant streaks of orange in the western sky, his shoulders heaving, the silver vessel held aloft like a plea, or perhaps a curse. His scream had torn through the quiet evening air, then vanished, leaving behind a silence so absolute, so profound, that it felt as if the very breath had been drawn from the world. Every fiber of my being was taut, waiting for an echo, a judgment, anything to break the unbearable tension. I remember my own heart pounding in my ears, a frantic drum beat against the stillness, and my lips still murmuring a desperate, unspoken prayer. Show him, Lord. Show him your face. And then it began, not with a clap of thunder, nor a descent from the heavens, but with something far more intimate, far more unsettling, and infinitely more beautiful. A faint tremor ran through the very air, a vibration I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. And then, from within, Leo, from the very core of his ravaged being, a light began to blossom. It was so soft at first, a mere glimmer, as if the last embers of the sunset had somehow migrated into his chest. But it grew, an impossible internal dawn. It was a soft, golden luminescence, not harsh or blinding, but gentle, warm, and utterly pervasive. It spread from his heart, outward, suffusing his threadbare clothes. The tattered fabric of his hooded sweatshirt, stained with the dust of the cemetery and the grime of his despair, seemed to dissolve, transfigured. It did not catch fire, nor did it burn away. Rather, it became incandescent, turning into what could only be described as robes of purest white light. The lines of exhaustion and grief etched upon his face seemed to smooth, his features momentarily softened by this impossible glow, making him look less like the broken man I knew, and more like a vessel, emptied of its sorrow and filled with an unbearable, sacred presence. I found myself taking an involuntary step back, my breath caught in my throat, my mind struggling to reconcile the ordinary man before me with this luminous, impossible transformation. It was real. It was happening. And as the light intensified around Leo, bathing him in an ethereal glow, something began to resolve behind him. It started as a shimmering in the air, a distortion of the twilight that pulsed with an unseen energy. Slowly, deliberately, it coalesced, forming an outline, a shape of unimaginable grace and power. It was not a physical being in the way we understand matter, yet its presence was more solid, more undeniable than anything I had ever witnessed. A figure of impossible majesty and gentle power began to resolve into form, taller than any man, slender and elegant, yet radiating an undeniable strength that seemed to anchor the very earth beneath us. It was an angel of the Lord, and its wings, Father, its wings were not of feather, but of pure, crystalline light, shimmering like 1,000 sunrises caught in a vast, silent motion. They unfurled slowly, not with the rustle of plumage, but with the quiet grandeur of a cosmic breath, reaching far beyond the breadth of the church doors, yet seeming to fit perfectly within the sacred space it now occupied. Its face, if it had one discernible in human terms, was not sharply defined. Rather, it was a focal point of pure, benevolent light, drawing you in, yet holding you at a respectful distance with its sheer holiness. Its presence was not merely seen, it was felt. A palpable wave of profound, absolute peace washed over the entire street, silencing the distant urban hum, hushing the chirping crickets, and most profoundly, stilling the frantic beating of my own heart. In that moment, fear was an impossibility, replaced by an awe so vast it bordered on terror, yet was entirely infused with boundless love. The angel did not speak in words, not in any tongue I knew. There was no booming voice from the heavens, no gentle whisper in my ear. Instead, there was a communication far more direct, far more profound, a flood of pure knowledge and love that poured directly into Leo's soul, and, incredibly, into mine. It bypassed the ears, the eyes, the mind, and went straight to the deepest part of our being, to that place where we are most truly ourselves, most open to the divine. And in that instant, we both understood. The grief, the anger, the despair, they had all been heard. Not merely acknowledged, but profoundly registered, understood and embraced by an infinite compassion. This was not a judgment. This was not a scolding for his sacrilege, nor a reward for his suffering. No, it was something far greater, far more tender. It was a rescue, a retrieval from the abyss of his desolation, a gentle hand extended not to pull him out of his pain, but to show him that even in the deepest recesses of that pain, he was not alone. The knowledge that poured into us was vivid, undeniable, and clearer than any spoken truth. Sophia was safe, not just at peace, not merely in heaven, but safe. Her spirit, whole and radiant, was held in a love beyond measure, beyond comprehension. The details of her journey, the beauty of her new existence, were not given in images or descriptions, but in a profound sense of her utter, joyful completion. It was a sign that his suffering had been heard, not in the courts of human justice or even earthly mercy, but in the highest courts of heaven itself, where every tear is counted and every broken heart is known. God's silence had not been absence, but a profound, mysterious waiting, preparing this very moment of unveiling. The weight of that revelation, the crushing beauty of that divine love, was too much for Leo's physical form to bear. As the last vestiges of the angel's radiant presence seemed to imprint itself upon his very soul, the stolen chalice, which had been his instrument of defiance, his bitter offering, suddenly slipped from his grasp. It fell, not with the dull thud of a dropped object, but with a resonant, almost musical clang on the worn stone steps of St. Michael's, a sound that echoed the breaking of something ancient and terrible within him. Leo's body, released from the impossible tension of his grief and the overwhelming power of the visitation, simply gave way. He collapsed, not with the sharp agony of a man breaking, but with the profound, yielding softness of one utterly undone. He lay crumpled on the hallowed ground, weeping, not in sorrow, Father, no. These were tears of pure, overwhelming, soul-shattering relief. The sound was raw, primal, the guttural sobs of a man who had carried the world on his shoulders and had, in one luminous, impossible moment, been utterly unburdened. The threshold of St. Michael's, which had been an altar of defiance, was now a cradle of renewed hope. The silence that followed Leo's collapse was not truly silent. It was filled with the shuddering echoes of his relief, the distant city hum, and the low, stunned murmurs of the few onlookers who had gathered, drawn by the unusual scene and then held captive by the inexplicable light. Detective Miller, usually so composed, stood frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the shimmering spot where the angel had been. The chalice lay on the worn stone, catching the last embers of the sunset, no longer a weapon, but a discarded burden. I knelt beside Leo, my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremors of a man reborn from the inside out, the raw sobs racking his frame. Later, much later, when Leo could speak, albeit in hushed, broken whispers, we crafted a narrative for the authorities. It was a story of profound grief, of a man losing himself in sorrow, taking a sacred object not for malice or profit, but as a desperate, misguided act of communion with a God he felt had abandoned him. I spoke of temporary insanity, of a spiritual crisis, of a deep longing for his daughter. Detective Miller, bless his pragmatic heart, corroborated it with a strange, newfound empathy in his eyes. He reported no theft, only a found chalice and a man in urgent need of pastoral care. He, too, I believe, had seen something that night that defied his rational world, something that softened the hard edges of his professional skepticism. For the handful of souls who had witnessed the impossible, scattered like seeds in the darkening street, drawn by an invisible force, no official explanation could erase what they had seen. Mrs. O'Malley, who lived across from the church and swore she saw something brighter than the sun, began attending daily mass again after years of only Christmas and Easter. Young Daniel, who had been cycling home and stopped, mesmerized, drew pictures of winged figures for weeks afterward, not with childish fantasy, but with the detailed awe of a witness. The miracle at St. Michael's did not undo the tragedy of Sophia's death. No, that wound, I knew, would always throb, a quiet ache in the deepest chambers of their hearts. But it transfigured it. It transfigured it into something profoundly different. Leo and Elena, though still steeped in grief, began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. There were no grand pronouncements, no sudden declarations of absolute faith. It was a quieter, deeper work. Elena, who had held on to her quiet faith like a fragile flame, now had the space for Leo to rejoin her, not as a defiant unbeliever, but as a man who had wrestled with God and seen his face. Their journey was not about forgetting Sophia, but about remembering her within the embrace of God's enduring love. Their faith was reborn, not in spite of their crushing loss, but in a profound way, through it. It was a faith honed by fire, tested in the crucible of despair, and reforged by divine mercy. I have often pondered the mystery of God's silence in our suffering. Before that night, I too had struggled with it, particularly in the face of Sophia's innocent pain. But the angel's visitation, that unspoken communication of pure knowledge and love, brought a truth that resonated deep within my priestly heart. God's silence is not absence. It is not indifference. Sometimes it is simply the infinite patient space within which our human hearts must struggle, must question, must even rage, until we are ready to receive His answer in a way we can truly comprehend. His mercy, I learned anew, is not bound by our limited understanding of justice or fairness. It is boundless, unexpected, and often manifests in ways that shatter our preconceived notions of what a miracle should look like. Now, when I raise the silver chalice during consecration, I see more than the precious vessel returned. I see a testament. I see the worn stone steps where it lay, a symbol of defiance transformed into an instrument of grace. It whispers not of desecration, but of revelation. It reminds me that sometimes the holiest thing a man can do, the most profound act of faith, is to bring his brokenness, his anger, his raw, unvarnished pain to the very threshold of God's house, to stand there, utterly exposed, and dare Him to show His face. And on that luminous day, He did. He met a broken man, not with judgment, but with an overwhelming embrace. He didn't take away the pain, but He revealed the enduring love that held it, the certainty that Sophia was not lost, but transformed, safe in eternal light. This is the lesson, dear friends, that I carry from that evening. Our faith is not in the absence of suffering, but in the certainty that even in our darkest nights, God is present. He is waiting, not always in the way we expect, but always, always, with a mercy that can transfigure our deepest wounds into windows upon His eternal glory. The path of faith is not easy, but it is never, ever walked alone.